Okay, buckle up, because today we're diving deep into two words we use all the time, but rarely stop to examine closely: models and structures.
What's fascinating about these terms is how they show up everywhere, from everyday conversations to high-level academic discussions. Our mission today is to bring some much-needed clarity to these deceptively simple words.
And to help us on this journey, we're turning to the work of Michel and Alain Badiou, two thinkers who really dug into this topic. We'll be exploring their conversation as captured in their book Serres et Badiou, Modèle et structure trois émissions.pdf.
Their work is incredibly insightful. They trace the historical evolution of these concepts, break down their different uses, and even show how they play out in something as seemingly unrelated as literature.
Okay, let's unpack this. Maybe the best place to start is with some simple definitions. What exactly do we mean by structure and model?
A structure is basically a way of organizing things based on specific rules or relationships. Think of it as an underlying pattern that dictates how things connect and behave.
So like the structure of a building, you can't see it, but it determines how everything fits together, right?
Exactly. And just like with a building, structures can be found in all sorts of places, in nature, in language, even in our thoughts.
Okay, that makes sense. So how does the idea of a model fit into all of this?
A model is a simplified representation of something more complex. It's like a tool we use to understand, predict, or even manipulate things in the real world.
So a model airplane, for example, would be a model of a real airplane.
That's a great example. It captures the basic shape and design of the real thing, but it's simplified. And that's key, because models are all about simplification. They help us make sense of things that are too complex to grasp in their entirety.
So models act as a kind of bridge between our minds and the complexities of the world around us.
Precisely. And just like there are many types of bridges, there are many types of models. Some models are theoretical, existing only as ideas in our minds. Others are physical objects we can touch and interact with.
So to use our earlier example, the model airplane would be a physical model, whereas a diagram of how airplanes fly would be more of a theoretical model.
You got it. And don't forget about those incredibly detailed model train sets some people build.
Okay, you're right. Those are serious models, complete with miniature landscapes and tiny people. It's amazing how much detail goes into creating a good model.
And that brings us to another important point. Models aren't meant to be perfect replicas of reality. They're tools for understanding, and sometimes that means leaving things out, simplifying, or even exaggerating certain aspects.
So it's less about creating a perfect copy and more about capturing the essence of something.
Exactly. Now, before we go any further, we should probably acknowledge that the way we use the word model in everyday life isn't always consistent with its more rigorous definition.
You mean like when we talk about a new car model or someone being a role model?
Precisely. Those are perfectly valid uses of the word, but they don't necessarily capture the same depth of meaning as when we're talking about models in a scientific or philosophical context.
So we need to be careful not to confuse those everyday uses with the more nuanced ways we're discussing model today.
Exactly. It's all about context. Now, getting back to the relationship between model and structure, it's important to remember that a model can be seen as a specific instance of a structure.
Can you give me an example of what you mean?
Let's take the concept of a family. You could say that the idea of a family, in general, represents a kind of structure. It implies certain roles and relationships between individuals.
Like parents, children, siblings, all those different roles that make up a family unit.
Exactly. Now, your specific family, with its unique dynamics and history, could be seen as a model of that broader family structure. It's one particular way that the abstract idea of a family gets expressed in the real world.
So in a way, all families, despite their differences, are like models of this overarching family structure.
You've got it. And this idea that a single structure can have multiple models is essential for understanding how these concepts work.
It's like saying there are many ways to build a house, even if they all share certain structural similarities.
Exactly. Now, to really understand these concepts, we need to dig a little deeper into their history. Did you know that the idea of structure, as we understand it today, actually emerged in the 17th century?
I didn't. I would have guessed it was a much more modern concept. Tell me more.
Well, back then, thinkers like Leibniz were already using the term structure to describe the arrangement of things, particularly in nature.
So they were looking at things like how plants grow or how the human body is organized.
Exactly. Think about Leibniz studying the anatomy of animals, how the bones fit together, how the organs are arranged. That's the kind of thing they were talking about when they used the word structure.
So the idea of underlying patterns and relationships has been around for quite a while. But what about the term model? Where does that come into play?
Well, model actually has even older roots, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Plato, for example, used the term to describe how our senses perceive the world around us.
So even back then, they were grappling with the idea of representation, of how we create mental images of the world.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. The use of model to describe how we gain knowledge, what we now call epistemology, didn't really take off until the 19th century.
And that's where Pierre Duhem enters the picture.
Precisely. Duhem, a physicist, was instrumental in formalizing the idea of model as a tool for scientific investigation. He argued that we don't observe reality directly, but rather through the lens of models that we construct.
So instead of studying the world as it really is, we build these simplified representations models to help us make sense of it.
Exactly. And those models aren't just passive reflections of reality. They're active tools that shape how we understand and interact with the world.
That's fascinating. So even our most objective scientific endeavors are influenced by these models we create.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to understand how models work, their strengths, their limitations, and the potential biases they might introduce.
This is definitely making me think about the models I use in my own life, often without even realizing it. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's step back for a moment and consider some of the common ways we use the word model that might not quite align with this more rigorous definition.
Right. Like we touched on earlier, those everyday uses can sometimes muddy the waters.
Exactly. So let's take a little detour and explore some of these everyday models and why they might not be the best examples of the concept we're exploring today.
Okay, let's play a little game of is it really a model? First up, the classic model airplane. It's a scaled down replica, sure, but does it fit the deeper definition we've been discussing?
That's a good question. It's definitely a representation of a real airplane, but I don't know, it's not like it's helping us understand some complex concept.
Exactly. The model airplane is more about physical resemblance than conceptual understanding. The ancient Greeks had a term for this kind of scaled-down representation, actually. They called it a module.
Ah, so it's like those miniature models architects use to visualize their designs.
Precisely. They're helpful for visualization and planning, but they don't necessarily deepen our understanding of the underlying principles of architecture in the same way that a theoretical model might.
Okay, I see the distinction. So what about the artist's model? How does that use of the word model stack up against our more rigorous definition?
Now that's an interesting one. The artist's model takes us right back to Plato's ideas about representation. It's all about capturing the essence of something, but in a different form.
And this goes beyond just painting a portrait, right? I mean, think about a sculpture or even a live model for a drawing class.
Absolutely. Think about Velázquez's famous painting Las Meninas. It's not just a depiction of a scene. It's a meditation on the very act of painting itself, with the models right there in the studio. And then you have Picasso, who took that idea even further with his later variations on Las Meninas. He really deconstructed the whole concept of model and representation, showing how art can be a reflection of reality, but also a commentary on it.
Wow, that's pretty meta when you think about it.
It is. So the artist's model is definitely more than just a subject to be copied. It's a springboard for exploring ideas about perception, representation, and even the nature of art itself.
Okay, so the artist's model definitely seems to fit our more nuanced understanding of the word. But what about the new car model? That one always felt a bit weak to me.
Yeah, you're right to be skeptical. That's probably the least conceptually rich use of the term model. It's simply the latest version, a new iteration of an existing design.
Yeah, it's not like they're reinventing the wheel with each new car model, right? They just slap on some new headlights and call it a day.
Exactly. It's more about marketing and branding than about any deep conceptual shift.
Okay, so we've covered some common but potentially misleading uses of the word model. Now let's get back to those more rigorous and insightful ways that models help us understand the world. Earlier, you mentioned that there are different types of models, right? Can we unpack that a bit further?
Absolutely. One helpful way to think about models is in terms of their structure. So we can have purely theoretical models, like those used in mathematics or physics, which exist primarily as ideas or equations.
Okay, so like Einstein's theory of relativity, that's a model of how gravity works, but it's not something we can hold in our hands, right? It's a set of mathematical equations.
Exactly. It's a powerful model because it makes predictions that can be tested even though it describes phenomena that are really difficult to observe directly.
That makes sense. But what about models that are a bit more tangible? You also mentioned something about schemas and diagrams, right? Those seem a bit more concrete.
Right. These are visual models that use concrete elements to represent something more abstract.
Yeah, okay, now you're speaking my language. Got any good examples?
Well, think about something like a family tree. It uses a simple diagram of branches and lines to represent those complex family relationships across generations.
Oh, I see. Or even something as simple as a map. It's a visual representation of a geographical area, but it uses all those symbols and colors to convey information about roads, landmarks, distances.
Exactly. And these visual models aren't just for everyday use. They play a crucial role in scientific discovery as well. Take, for instance, Bohr's model of the atom.
Oh yeah, I remember that one from school. The atom as a miniature solar system with the electrons orbiting the nucleus like planets around the sun.
Exactly. Now, while we know that model is an oversimplification, it was revolutionary at the time because it helped scientists visualize the atom and make important strides in understanding atomic structure.
So even though it wasn't entirely accurate, it kind of paved the way for further discoveries.
Exactly. And this speaks to an important point about models. They're not meant to be the final word. They're tools that can be refined, revised, even discarded as our understanding evolves.
That's a good reminder that even in science, our knowledge is always evolving. So we've got theoretical models, visual models like diagrams and schemas. What other types of models are out there?
Well, then there are the physical models, the ones we can actually touch and interact with.
You mean like those miniature towns that urban planners use to visualize traffic flow? Or those scale models architects build to present their designs?
Exactly. These physical models are incredibly useful for testing ideas, identifying potential problems, and communicating complex concepts in a really tangible way.
And don't forget about those incredible model train sets.
You're right. Those can be incredibly detailed and sophisticated, with miniature landscapes, working lights, even tiny people going about their day.
It's amazing how much effort and detail goes into creating a good model, whether it's a theoretical model of the universe or a miniature replica of a steam engine.
It really speaks to our human desire to understand the world around us, doesn't it? We build models to make sense of things, to see how they work, to explore possibilities.
It's like this innate drive to represent the world around us, even if those representations are always going to be simplifications.
That's a great way to put it. And like any simplification, there are always going to be trade-offs.
That's right. It's about knowing when to use a particular model, being aware of its limitations, and being willing to revise or even discard it if it's no longer serving its purpose.
Exactly. The danger comes when we become too attached to our models, mistaking them for reality itself, rather than recognizing them as the useful but imperfect tools they are.
It's like that old saying, the map is not the territory.
Precisely. A map can be an incredibly useful tool for navigating a territory, but it's essential to remember that it's a simplified representation, not the real thing.
So a healthy dose of skepticism is always a good thing when dealing with models.
Absolutely. We need to be critical thinkers, always asking ourselves, what are the assumptions built into this model? What are its limitations? And most importantly, is this model still serving its intended purpose, or is it time for a new one?
These are important questions to consider, especially in today's world where we're constantly bombarded with information and different ways of seeing things.
You're absolutely right. And this brings us to another crucial aspect of models. Their potential for both illumination and distortion.
That sounds intriguing. Tell me more about this double-edged sword nature of models.
Well, consider this. What happens when we take a model from one area of knowledge and try to apply it to another? It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, right?
That's quite a leap. Could this actually work, or is it a recipe for disaster?
It's definitely a risky move, but sometimes it can lead to amazing breakthroughs.
Give me an example.
Think about the explosion of information theory in the mid-20th century. Concepts like information, noise, and feedback, originally developed in the field of communication engineering, were suddenly being applied in fields like physics, biology, and even economics.
So ideas were flowing freely between disciplines, leading to unexpected connections and new discoveries.
Right, exactly. But there are also cases where this model migration doesn't go so well. Take structuralism, for example. It was a movement that tried to apply concepts from linguistics, the study of language, to other areas like anthropology and literature.
So they were looking for the grammar of myths, the hidden rules that give them structure.
Precisely. And it led to some fascinating insights, like Levi-Strauss's analysis of myths. But there's also a danger here. Just because something seems structured like language doesn't mean it actually is language.
So the like problem. We have to be careful about making assumptions based on superficial similarities.
You got it. This is where the distinction between structure and model really matters. A structure is an underlying pattern, but a model is a specific instance of that pattern. It's a way of testing whether the proposed structure actually holds up to scrutiny.
So it's not enough to simply identify patterns. We need to rigorously test them with a model.
Precisely. It's like saying that a building might have a certain structural design, but each individual house built according to that design will be unique. The structure provides the blueprint, but the model brings the design to life in a specific way.
That's a great analogy. So how did Serres and Badiou approach this interplay between structure and model in their work?
They looked at literature as a rich source of examples for understanding these concepts, and they found a fascinating case study in one of the most iconic characters in literature, Don Juan.
Don Juan, the ultimate rebel, the seducer, the one who defies all conventions. What could he possibly have to do with models and structures?
Well, Serres and Badiou argue that Don Juan's behavior can be seen as a model for a particular structure, the structure of gift exchange.
Gift exchange. You're taking us to the world of anthropology and social relations now. That's quite a leap.
It might seem unexpected, but it makes sense when you think about it. Gift exchange isn't just about exchanging objects. It's about establishing social bonds and obligations.
So gift giving is actually a fundamental aspect of human society.
Absolutely. And Don Juan is basically a master at disrupting this gift-giving structure.
How so?
He's constantly taking without giving back. He seduces women and then abandons them, leaving them with nothing but the experience of being seduced.
So he's a master of manipulation, breaking the rules of reciprocity.
Precisely. And it goes beyond just material goods. Don Juan is also a master of language, a smooth talker. He uses words to gain something without giving anything in return.
He's a manipulator of language, wielding words as weapons to get what he wants.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. Serres and Badiou argue that the model for Don Juan's behavior is actually present within the play itself.
What do you mean? Give me an example.
In a key scene, Don Juan gives a passionate speech in praise of tobacco. He describes how tobacco should be given as a gift, how its use creates a bond between people, how it's a way of expressing generosity.
That's a bit ironic considering Don Juan's general lack of generosity.
It is, and that's the point. The praise of tobacco is a microcosm of Don Juan's overall approach. It's a model for how he interacts with everything, money, women, even words. He's all about receiving, about taking, about manipulating the system to his advantage.
So, that one speech encapsulates the essence of his character.
It does. And the fact that it's present within the play itself is key. It's not just about applying a model from outside. It's about recognizing how the model is already embedded in the text.
So, what's the takeaway here?
When we talk about models and structures in literature, it's not about finding a rigid formula. It's about identifying patterns, recognizing how those patterns can be represented in different forms, and understanding how those forms might function as models for the reader.
Okay, that's a lot to chew on. So it's not about simply reading the text, but about reading it through the lens of models and structures.
Exactly. It's a way of seeing the text in a new light, uncovering its hidden depths, its unspoken meanings.
That's a powerful way of looking at literature, and it reminds us that models and structures aren't just abstract concepts. They are tools that can be used to enhance our understanding across disciplines.
And that brings us to the final point. As Serres and Badiou would argue, we need to be aware of the potential pitfalls of using models, especially when we're importing them from other fields.
Like the like problem we talked about earlier.
Precisely. We need to be careful not to assume that just because something seems structured like language or like gift-giving, that it actually is those things.
So it's about being mindful, using models and structures as tools for exploration, not as rigid frameworks for interpretation.
Absolutely. And ultimately, it's about recognizing that understanding the world is a constant process of refinement, of questioning our assumptions, and of seeking deeper levels of insight.
A fascinating and complex journey indeed. So what stands out to you? What are some models or structures you've been using or have been exposed to that have shaped your understanding of the world?
That's the real work of applying what we've discussed today, looking critically at our own assumptions and the models we build to make sense of the world around us. And I hope this deep dive has given you some tools for doing just that.